Hello, this is Professor Broker, and this lecture will cover the gains from trade, part 1. This is from Man-Q Text, chapter 3. In chapter 3, we're going to look at the answers to these questions. Why do people trade? Why do they choose to be economically interdependent? We'll talk about that. How can trade make everyone better off? Remember, that was one of our principles from chapter 1. We need to understand these terms. What is absolute advantage? What is comparative advantage? How are these concepts similar? How are they different? And specifically, going back to these concepts, absolute and comparative advantage, which one is more important to our idea of trade? So first, let's look at interdependence. You may not even realize how interconnected you are to the world economy, and how dependent you really are, interdependent you are on the rest, on people around the world. For example, your cell phone might be made in Taiwan. The coffee you're drinking might be originally come from Kenya. Your dress shirt might be made in China. You might use hair gel that's made in Cleveland, Ohio. I mean, if you just look at your wardrobe, your food, your automobile even if your automobile was made in the U.S., I mean, the parts in your automobile were likely made around the world. And so we live in a very interdependent economy, and so we need to understand how that works, what that looks like, and also why that is, and is that maybe the best economic way to structure society. So that's what we're going to look at in chapter 3. And one point I like to make kind of as we get started here about trade is some trade things you might see, trade stories you might see on the news, so on and so forth. Some trade numbers you might see sometimes can be deceiving. For example, you might read on the back of your cell phone that it was made in China. Like it says, right down here. It might say made in China or made in Taiwan or whatever, made somewhere. And the entire, how our trade statistics work is the entire value of that item, the final place of assembly that stamps its, made in China or made in Taiwan or made in the U.S., the entire value of that item will be counted. For example, if I buy this in the U.S., that'll be counted. The entire value of the phone will be counted as an import from China. Okay? And the point I like to make is that that can be deceptive because that entire phone was not made in China. Parts of that phone were manufactured in places like Germany, Korea, Japan, even the U.S. So even things we import from China, quote unquote import from China, parts of those items can actually be made in the U.S. and can actually support U.S. industry and U.S. jobs. And so it's a lot more complicated a lot of times than just looking at, if you see a news story that says we imported $100 billion worth of cell phones from China last year. Just remember that number, there's a big caveat to that number because a lot of those cell phone parts could have been made around the world and even the U.S. Okay, now when we talk about trade, first I like to talk about sports, right? So if someone wins a gold medal at the Olympics, right? That means they're the winner. And if they're the winner, that means there were losers. There can only be one winner. There can only be one gold medal recipient, theoretically. And so the sports is a zero-sum game. When there's a winner, that means there's a loser, okay? And, if you think about a soccer match, one side wins, one side loses, okay? That's how a lot of people think about trade. They think, okay, well, if the U.S. is benefiting, from trade with another country, then the other country must be losing. Or maybe, maybe the U.S. is trading with Mexico and Mexico is benefiting. That must mean that the U.S. is losing, right? It's a winner-loser relationship. And that's really not how trade is. That's not how economists look at trade. Trade is not a zero-sum game, oftentimes. This concept has the distinction of being one of the most important ideas in economics. It's also one of the least intuitive. Let me give you an example, right? Very famous president, Abraham Lincoln, in the 1860s, had this quote. In regards to building railroads and buying rails for the Civil War, to fight the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said this: "It seems to me that if we buy the rails from England, okay, in other words, import rails to build railroads to fight the war, if we buy those from England, then we've got the rails and they've got the money," meaning England, okay? "But if we build the rails in the U.S., then we've got our rails and we've got our money," okay? And that might sound, that's very intuitive and it sounds right, okay? And a lot of people probably would agree with that. Abraham Lincoln was, great president, probably not the greatest economist. And to illustrate that, let me give you his own reasoning in a different example. Okay, if I buy my milk, so I drink milk like a lot of people, and if I buy that milk from the store, then I get the milk, but the store gets the money, right? So that seems like a bad deal. So what if I keep a cow in my backyard and milk it myself every day, and feed it and make sure it has enough land and, just completely take care of it and basically create my own dairy operation? If I do that, right, then I'll have the milk and I'll still get to keep my money. Okay? Does that make... That's the same logic as Abraham Lincoln used. But just ask yourself, do you drink milk, right? And do you have a dairy cow in your backyard so that you don't have to go give the store your money? Okay? Now, some people grow up on dairy farms. My mom did, but most of us don't. Most of us that buy milk don't keep a cow in your backyard. The reason is because your time is better spent doing other things. And this is the same principle. This is actually the principle of comparative advantage that we're going to look at. And this principle applies to us individually, and there's no reason to believe that it doesn't apply to countries as well. In fact, we have lots of good reasons to think it does apply to countries, and that's what the whole point of this chapter is. Okay, now when we talk about measuring, how much does it cost, a nation to produce rails, or how much does it cost a nation to produce milk, or an individual family to produce their own milk? How much does it cost them? Okay, there are two ways to measure those costs. One way to measure it is through inputs required, or in other words, productivity. How much, just kind of raw productivity. Okay, we call this measuring. Using this type of cost, we can measure what's called an absolute advantage. It's the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. So, for example, if I'm measuring who can grow the most bananas, if I compare New York City to some nation in the Caribbean like the Bahamas is probably going to have an absolute advantage in producing bananas because they have a much better climate for producing bananas, and so they would be able to do it more productively, and they would have an absolute advantage most likely. Okay, so we can measure it using inputs, raw productivity. This is how most people think we should look at trade. But that's actually not the most advantageous way to look at trade. Okay, another type of cost is a cost we've already looked at called opportunity cost. Remember that? It's the cost of something that you get. The cost of something for anything you're looking at is what you give up to get it. Okay, which doesn't just include inputs. It also includes what you could have used those inputs to produce. Okay, your other opportunities, in other words. And if we look at opportunity cost and measure opportunity cost, then we can calculate something called, or derive something called comparative advantage, which is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Okay, and so this basically gives us two theories of trade. And let me illustrate the two theories of trade with an example. A lawyer might be really good at both typing legal briefs and working with clients to generate revenue for her firm. In other words, she could be a really good typist and she could be a really good lawyer. Okay? Let's just say that she has an absolute advantage, meaning she's the most productive lawyer in her law firm and she's the most productive typist in her law firm. Okay? She's both. She is the most productive at both. She has an absolute advantage in both productions, if you will. Okay? Does that mean that she should do both? Okay, a lot of people would say, yes, of course. She's the best at both. But, just think about it from a reasonable perspective. Do you think it might make sense that even though she's the best typist and the best lawyer, do you think it might make some sense that she could benefit from hiring a typist? So that she can focus more of her time on actually, meeting with clients and litigating cases and so on and so forth. The answer would be obviously yes. She would most likely be able to benefit tremendously, even if she hires a typist who isn't able to type quite as fast as her, and she paid them a wage. She would be better off because she would be able to focus more of her time on being a lawyer. This is what's called having a comparative advantage. Okay, doing what she is comparatively, she's best at both. She's most productive at both. But if she focuses on what she has the what she is comparatively better at, then actually both sides can be better off. Not only her and her law firm, but also the person she hires as a typist would be better off as well. Okay? So again, should Tom Brady mow his own lawn? He's around a lot of grass, and he's also pretty good football player. So does that mean he should mow his own lawn? Or even if he's the best at mowing his lawn, or could he potentially benefit from hiring someone to mow his own lawn? Martha Stewart, really good at ironing clothes, also good at producing her show, although or at least she was. And does that mean that she should iron her own clothes just because she's the best at both? Or could she free up her time to do something by hiring someone to iron her clothes so that she could focus on what she's comparatively better at? And then we apply this to, can the U.S. benefit from trading with a relatively less productive economy like Vietnam? The U.S. is really good at making a lot of things. We have a very diverse economy. We have good farmland. We have good industry. We have high human capital, we have high physical capital, we have technology. I mean, we have a great economy. And, does that mean that we can't benefit from trading? Just like the lawyer, she was good at typing and being a lawyer. Does that mean she couldn't benefit from hiring a typist? That's what we're going to look at. Okay, so let's look at a very simplistic example. We're going to break it down, look at it simply in a very simple model, just looking at two goods, TVs and steel, and we're going to look at two countries, the U.S. and Vietnam. And we're going to look at units of output per hour per worker. We're going to say a U.S. worker can produce 12 televisions per hour of work, or 6 units of television, or 6 units of steel, okay, or somewhere in between with a constant trade-off. This is basically a production possibilities table, okay, and we're going to look at the graph here in a second. So the U.S. could possibly produce, using our production possibilities table, 12 TVs if they devoted all of their resources to TVs, or 6 units of steel if they devoted all of their resources to producing steel, or somewhere in between, some combination of those goods. Okay, and then Vietnam, if they devoted all of their resources to producing televisions, could produce 8 televisions per hour of work, or 2 units of steel, or some combination in between. Okay, now this is obviously the world's more complicated than 2 countries and 2 goods, but we're going to hopefully derive some principles from this simple example that will apply to the broader world. Okay, so this is our example. Which country has an absolute advantage? Well, okay, when you're looking at production numbers, which is what these are, okay, to find an absolute advantage, you simply find the nation or person or entity that produces the most, right? So in terms of absolute advantage, the U.S. can make 12 televisions. Vietnam can make 8 televisions using the same amount of resources. So the U.S. would have an absolute advantage in television production because they can produce more. What about steel? Right? Who can produce more steel using the same amount of resources, 1 worker per hour? The U.S. can produce 6, Vietnam 2. So the U.S. has an absolute advantage both in televisions and in steel production. Okay, and so it would seem intuitively that the U.S. could not benefit from trading with Vietnam. That's the question we're going to look at and answer. Now, we're going to look at and answer this based on comparative advantage. We're going to try to apply the principle of opportunity cost and try to derive and see if the countries have different opportunity costs for producing these items. And we're going to see if Vietnam might actually have an opportunity cost advantage compared to the U.S. in one of these goods, maybe indicating that they should produce that good. And then we're going to see if they traded based on that, what would happen. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. So here's the U.S.'s production possibilities graph. This is their frontier, right? And so I said they could produce 12 TVs, right? Or 6 units of steel, or some combination in between. Now, if the U.S. is self-sufficient, this is an important point, right? This is their production possibilities frontier. Notice it's linear, which remember means that they have a constant trade-off between resources being used for TVs versus resources being used for steel, okay? So that's important to keep in mind. Remember that we learned that in chapter 2. Now, if we are self-sufficient, what are we limited to consuming as a nation, right? We are limited to consuming only that which we can produce. So the U.S., this line represents what they can produce as a nation given our resources, which means this also represents, if we don't trade with anybody and we're totally self-sufficient, this also represents our consumption possibilities. Okay, that's important to remember. Now, if I want to know how much costs to make a TV in the U.S., right, I would want to know how many units of steel per television does it cost the U.S. To produce, right? So I would want to take, since we have constant trade-offs, we have a linear line, we can simply take the endpoints and divide them against one another. So I can take 6 divided by 12, right, and figure out that the opportunity cost for the U.S. to make one television is actually half of a unit of steel, 6 divided by 12. And I can simply reverse the process to figure out how much does it cost them in terms of opportunity cost to make a unit of steel. Well, it would take them 12 TVs divided by 6 units of steel, or 2 televisions. The opportunity cost for the U.S. to make 1 unit of steel is actually 2 televisions. Now remember, this is in terms of opportunity cost. Okay? In other words, if the U.S. decides to make televisions, that means they're sacrificing the opportunity to make steel, and vice versa. And so these are our opportunity costs. Okay? Notice they're also that they are reciprocals. Okay? This is going to be true in our examples. And so it's an easy way to remember, if my opportunity cost to make a unit of steel is 1 divided by 2, then their opportunity cost if their opportunity cost of making a television is 1/2 unit of steel, then their other opportunity cost will be the reciprocal of that, which will be 2. Okay? Now, let's look at Vietnam. Vietnam has a production possibilities frontier that looks like this, right? They can make 8 televisions, right? Or 2 units of steel, or somewhere in between. And if I want to know their opportunity cost of making a television, I would take 2 units of steel divided by 8 televisions, and realize that it costs them, they have an opportunity cost when they make a television of 1/4 units of steel, 2 divided by 8. And then the reciprocal of that would be 4. So when they decide to make a unit of steel, it would cost them 8 divided by 2, or 4 televisions. Okay, those are the opportunity costs for Vietnam. Now, if you follow those numbers, right, hopefully you realized that by comparing them, you actually realized that at least for one of the goods, the U.S. would have an opportunity cost advantage, and the other good, Vietnam would actually have an opportunity cost advantage. Let's look at which one those were. Right now, if we look at steel, remember that the opportunity cost of producing steel for the U.S. was 2 televisions, whereas in Vietnam it was 4. The U.S. thus would have a lower opportunity cost. Okay, that's what you want to look for. In other words, it's cheaper. When we look at their other opportunities, it's less expensive if we look at opportunity costs for the U.S. to make steel compared to Vietnam. Therefore, the U.S. has a comparative advantage in steel production, and thus the U.S. would benefit from trade by specializing in steel production, making more than they need, and exporting that which they have the comparative advantage in, which is steel. Okay, now, sort of a little caveat here is I want to think about, is there a specific price range for which for steel that the U.S. and Vietnam should trade within this price range that can lead to beneficial trade for both countries? Okay, and to do this, I want us to think about the opportunity cost. Okay, remember, how much does it cost the U.S. to make a unit of steel in terms of TV production? Remember, it was 2. It costs the U.S. 2 TVs every time they make a unit of steel. Okay, so if that's their cost, think about a business. They're usually in the habit of wanting to make a profit, right? Which means they have to sell something for more than it costs them. Okay, so in this case, we're not using dollars, but if it costs the U.S. 2 TVs to make steel in their own country, okay, then how much, if they sent some steel to Vietnam, how many TVs would at a minimum they want in return? At a minimum, just to break even, they would want 2, right? So that would be the bottom end of our price range for beneficial trade. But let's think about the top range. Of course, the U.S. would want, 1 million TVs per unit of steel, but Vietnam's not going to be willing to trade anything. Vietnam has a limit too. Think about it. How much would Vietnam be willing to pay? How many TVs would Vietnam be willing to send at a maximum to the U.S. for steel? Well, the answer would be how much it costs them in their own country, right? It costs them 4 TVs for every unit of steel they produce. So they're not going to be willing to pay more. They're not going to be willing to pay the U.S. more than that, right? Because it'd be like, Walmart charging $1 million for a gallon of milk. Well, if a gallon of milk is $1 million at Walmart, it would actually probably be beneficial at that point for me to keep my own dairy cow at home and milk it myself rather than pay them $1 million, right? And so at some point, it would make sense for me to not trade if the price is too high. And that price for Vietnam is 4 TVs to the U.S. So the price range for beneficial trade for steel to trade within these countries would be between 2 and 4 televisions. Okay, if we get outside of that range, then both sides wouldn't benefit. So both sides would have an advantage to set trading terms within this range for steel. Okay, now let's look at televisions. The opportunity cost of producing a television in Vietnam was 1/4 of a television. Okay, and the opportunity cost of producing a TV in the U.S. was 1/2 of a unit of steel, right? 1/4 of a unit of steel versus 1/2 of a unit of steel. The opportunity cost for producing a TV is actually lower in Vietnam, right? This should be surprising because remember, the U.S. had an absolute advantage in both items, but the Vietnam actually has a comparative advantage in TV production. Thus, Vietnam would benefit from specializing in TV production, making more than they need, and exporting some of those to the U.S. There would also be a beneficial trading range for which TVs should trade per units of steel. And again, using the same analysis, a TV should trade between 1/4 and 1/2 units of steel in order for both of these countries to benefit. Thus, both countries would have an incentive to set trading terms within this price range. Okay? So, now, we really haven't shown anything yet. We've just established that each country has a separate comparative advantage. So now what we want to do is we want to see if they trade within the beneficial trading range based on these comparative advantages, are there any benefits to be had? Okay, so let's put the U.S. and Vietnam both on the screen. These are their production possibilities curves. And remember, without trade, these also represent these countries' consumption possibilities curves. In other words, it's a representation of their standard of living for the average citizen. Okay, now let's just arbitrarily set a price range. I'm going to say that 1 unit of steel trades for 3 televisions. Okay, it's a constant trading term. This is the trading term that's set. This is actually right in the middle, if you'll remember, of the beneficial price range. So so this would be attractive to both countries, but I'm just arbitrarily setting it. Okay, you don't have to derive this or anything. Okay, 1 unit of steel for 3 televisions. Now, just to exemplify the changes, I'm going to assume that each country totally specializes in the good for which they have the comparative advantage, okay, just to exemplify the changes, okay? So the U.S. is going to totally specialize in steel production, okay, because that's what they have the comparative advantage in. That's what we calculated. They're going to make the 6 units of steel per worker per hour, okay? Now, let's just say that they trade 2 of those, okay? They make more than they need, and so they trade 2 of those. They export 2 units of steel, okay, to Vietnam. Now, in exchange for exporting 2 units of steel per hour to Vietnam, they're going to get what in return? Well, the trading terms say they're going to get 3 TVs per unit of steel, so 2 units of steel would lead to 6 televisions, okay? So notice, they produced here, the U.S., they exported 2, in other words, they subtracted 2 of those units and sent them to Vietnam, and in exchange, they got 6 televisions, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is their new consumption point. After trade, they're consuming at point U. They have 4 units of steel remaining, and they've imported 6 televisions. What is awfully conspicuous about point U? Okay? It's outside the curve. It's outside their production possibilities curve. Okay? In other words, after trade, the U.S. is consuming, its citizens are consuming. Okay, they have a higher standard of living. They have a standard of living that's outside their previous productive capabilities. They're consuming more than they could produce on their own. Okay? And you might say that's amazing. That's unfathomable. How could that happen? You would have told me in chapter 2 that this was an unattainable point, that we did not have enough resources to produce at that level. And you would have been correct. But with trade, points that were previously unattainable can now be attained as a standard of living, not because of more resources, but simply because we're trading based on comparative advantage. This is an example of the benefits of trade. It raises standards of living. Okay, this is one small example of that. Now, you might say, though, yeah, but the U.S. is dominant in this trading situation. They have more resources. They have absolute advantages. So I'm sure that they've increased their standard of living probably by robbing from Vietnam. Well, let's see if Vietnam benefits. Okay, so Vietnam, remember, they had the the comparative advantage in TV production, so they're going to produce 8. Okay. Now, remember, they sent 6 of those to the U.S., okay? So they're going to go 8 minus 6 down here to 2, and they're going to, again, this is per hour, and they're going to import 2 units of steel per hour, leaving them at point V. Now, what is awfully conspicuous about point V? The same situation, right? These 2 countries were limited, okay? They were limited to consuming only what they could produce before trade. When they were self-sufficient, they could only consume on this line or within this line. But not because of new resources, not because of new technology, not because of anything except simply trading with each other based on comparative advantage. Both of these countries now have higher standards of living. That's what we've been able to show through this simple example. Okay, now let's look at the gains from trade just a little bit more deeply. Okay, to do this, I'm going to have to assume, something, a situation before trade. Let's assume before trade, that the U.S. and Vietnam are both consuming on their production possibilities curve, which is what they're limited to, and they're somewhere in the middle. The U.S. is consuming 3 units of steel and 6 televisions. Is that possible? Say 6 units of television and 3 steel. That would be right here. That would be possible for the U.S. And Vietnam, 2 units of steel and 0 TVs. Okay, 2 units of steel and 0 TVs. That would be on the curve, and that would be possible for Vietnam before trade. Okay, now total world production, comparing the total world. If U.S. and Vietnam were the only countries in the world, total world production of TVs before trade would be 6 plus 0, or 6, right? And total world production of steel, would be 3 plus 2, or 5 units of steel, right? Does everyone agree? Okay. Now, after trade, remember, we deduced that the U.S. would consume 4 units of steel and 6 TVs. After production and then exporting and importing, they would be left with 4 units of steel and 6 TVs. Remember, this was outside their production possibilities curve. Okay. Vietnam, remember, consumed 2 steel and 2 TVs after specializing and then exporting and importing. Thus, total world production after trade of TVs jumped to what? 6 plus 2. The new world production of TVs is now 8. Okay? And the new world production of steel is 4 plus 2, which is now 6. So we can show that we can actually tabulate the gains from trade per unit of labor per hour as we've gained 2 TVs, right? Compare 6 to 8. Simply by trading with one another, the entire world now has 2 extra televisions per hour and 1 extra unit of steel per hour. Okay? These are the gains from trade. Okay? This is why economists tend to favor trade policies, specifically based on comparative advantage, is because it makes for a more productive world and thus higher standards of living, which is what we've been able to illustrate with this very simple example that also would apply in much more complicated scenarios. Okay, so some points, right, would be that trade allows people to specialize in the activities for which they have the comparative advantage. It basically divides the labor. We get a division of labor, which makes us more productive. Because of specialization in trade, total output in the world economy rises, making everyone better off. Okay, because there's more stuff to divvy up. Okay, raising standards of living. And we've seen this. Now, in reality, there are real winners and losers from trade. Okay, no one's trying to deny that. The losers can be characterized by lost jobs in certain industries. So, for example, if the U.S. specializes in steel production because that's what they have the comparative advantage in, clearly some jobs would be lost in the television industry. And vice versa in Vietnam, if they specialize in TV production, then they would have some job losses in the steel industry. Now, those and there might be one of our principles was that governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. A lot of economists would readily recognize that if we do trade, we're going to have maybe some lost jobs for industries we don't have a comparative advantage in. And so maybe the government can play a role in helping those workers transition to new industries. For example, the winners in each country can be characterized by jobs gained in other industries. So, for example, even though TV jobs are lost in the U.S., there's actually, the steel industry is actually hiring workers, and maybe they could hire some of those former TV workers. And in Vietnam, they're specializing in TV production, so the TV industry is actually adding jobs. And so they might be able to hire some of those former steel workers, okay? And not only are some jobs gained in the export industries, but also there's lower prices overall. The prices of TVs in this world economy would go down. The price of steel would likely go down, which would benefit all of the world participants, okay? And through a general increase in productivity. And then as we measure this out, the reason we say trade can make everyone better off is because the overall net effect, if we compare the winners and the losers, tends to be a net positive. In other words, the gains to the winners when we trade based on comparative advantage tend to far outweigh the losses to the losers. And this is why we say trade can make everyone better off. We will discuss more of this in part 2 of the gains from trade.